more refreshment served. That's it. Yes, as we said earlier, technically we shouldn't be allowing too many people in when there are no free spaces left. So if you could squeeze into some places, or yeah, I don't know anymore. So I think we can start with the next session. Miroslav Cupák will present some great things about Jenkins. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Hi, everybody. It's really great to see so many people interested in Jenkins here at DevConf. And welcome to my talk about top 40 plugins for Jenkins. My name is Miroslav Cupák. I'm a software engineer at DNA Stack. I've been using Jenkins for about 5 years now. I've been contributing to Jenkins for about a year and working as an administrator on an instance at Red Hat as well. Before that, I was a quality engineer at Red Hat, so I'm hoping that this kind of mixed QE development as well as administration background gives me a relatively reasonable perspective to pick plugins that you might find interesting. Before we start, I would like to just mention that Jenkins is extremely popular. It's the most widely used CI in the world. And just recently, Jenkins approached 100,000 active installations in the world, which is quite amazing. And these are just installations that actually submit usage statistics. In total, these are using 3.2 million of independent plugin instances, which gives you an interesting average of 32 plugins per instance, which just shows how much more you can get out of Jenkins if you're actually taking advantage of the plugins. Last time I checked, there were 1,050 plugins in upstream, which just raises the question, how do you find the right plugins? How do you choose what to use? And that's the kind of question I want to answer in this talk. So think of this kind of as my personal list of top 40 plugins, which is largely based on what we were using at Red Hat, plus a couple of extra plugins that I just think are interesting and that you might be interested in using. So number one, Dashboard View. It's a really cool plugin which offers you kind of a portal-like view for Jenkins. It actually comes with a bunch of portlets. You can see here there's a build statistics portlet and job statistics portlet. You can also display some statistics about slaves and sort of aggregated test results across multiple jobs. What's really cool about this plugin is that you can split your jobs into folders or different views, and you can select which jobs you want to include in the statistics. So as a team leader, for example, you could just have multiple jobs for different components of your system, and you could immediately check how the release is progressing on each of those components. I mentioned you can split jobs into folders. That's actually functionality that is not provided by Jenkins by default. But it is being taken care of by the CloudBased Folders plugin. There are actually a couple of plugins which are sort of trying to group jobs in a way. CloudBased Folders, in my opinion, is the best one there is. So essentially, it gives you sort of a file system-like structure to jobs. You can create folders, subfolders, put jobs into different folders, this sort of thing. BuiltTimeout is really a must-have on any Jenkins instance. The situation is that builds occasionally get stuck. Sometimes it's because something went wrong in Jenkins. Sometimes it's because you didn't write your test correctly. And in this case, a build is occupying a slave, and it's reducing the throughput in your lab. So it's very important to deal with this problem, and that's what BuiltTimeout plugin does. The plugin basically allows you to configure your job to be automatically terminated once it's stuck for a certain amount of time. So you can, for example, configure things like, if this build is stuck for 3 minutes, abort it. If it's stuck for 150% of the time it usually takes, abort it as well. I mentioned on the previous slide that it works most of the time because there are some sort of marginal situations when it may not be possible to interrupt the job. For example, if it's stuck doing some kind of I/O operation and this sort of thing. But most of the time, it actually does the trick. Workspace Clean Up, another very useful plugin. Jobs in Jenkins operate with notion of workspaces, which is essentially a directory where builds put all their data. And by default, these directories survive the builds. With Workspace Cleanup, you can choose whether you want to remove the workspace before or after the job, which allows you to start your job with a clean sort of slate, or it also helps you basically reduce disk space occupied by your jobs. The notion of source code management in Jenkins is implemented through providers. So you have Subversion provider to access data from Subversion. You have Git provider provided as part of the Git plugin. and so on and so forth. One thing that is not possible in Jenkins by default is getting data from multiple repositories from different providers. So a typical use case would be you have your functional tests in a different repository than your application, or you're building a project which relies on some third-party library, and that library is in Subversion, whereas your project is on GitHub, things like that. Multiple SCMs adds a configuration option to your job configuration, and basically you can specify multiple repositories. The only way in Jenkins to restrict where your jobs run is by specifying a label expression. And that's done in the configuration of a job, so it's fairly static. NoLabel parameter plugin makes this more dynamic. So it introduces two new parameter types into jobs. You have a node and you have a label parameter, and you can specify sort of candidate nodes that you can select from and some kind of a default value, so that when you actually run the build, you get a choice and you get to choose where you want to run the job. It's actually possible to configure it in a way so that you can select multiple slaves, and then Jenkins automatically spawns multiple builds on these slaves. So it's actually very practical if you need to test several different configurations at once. Jenkins uses the concept of triggers. You don't need to trigger your job manually. You can trigger a job when there's a new commit in the repository and this sort of thing. URL trigger is an interesting plugin which can trigger a job whenever there's a change detected on a given URL. So it's very flexible and very versatile. One use case which is shown here is I'm checking Nexus repository for new artifacts, and whenever I detect a new artifact, I can run a new build which includes this artifact. There are a couple of options. You can either check for the content on the URL or just compare MD5 sums, or you can even check whether a specific property in an XML or in JSON changed. So it's quite flexible. HTML Publisher, again, a very flexible plugin. It essentially allows you to publish any kind of HTML content within Jenkins. That's very practical because many tools, like code coverage tools or something like that, they publish their reports in HTML. And with this plugin, you can expose it in Jenkins. So all you need to do is basically add a post build action, configure which file you want to expose. And what that does is it adds a link to the given report to your job page. So after clicking that, you get to the actual HTML, which might be a code coverage report or something else. Embeddable build status is a very nice sort of tiny plugin. I saw this thing for the first time with Travis, which is kind of a competition of Jenkins. They have this sort of hosted CI platform, which very nice GitHub integration. And sometimes with their GitHub projects, you see in README, they have this icon which says, build is passing or build is failing, which is kind of cool. And this plugin does the same thing for Jenkins. So it's very simple. After you install it, it provides another link which generates an image that you can embed on the website. So after clicking that, it basically tells you how to embed it in HTML, how to embed it in Markdown, and you can use it on GitHub. Matrix project plugin. I'm guessing most of you have been using Jenkins, so you're probably familiar with the notion of matrix projects. It's something that used to be in the core for a very long time. Now it's a part of the plugin, but the plugin is still bundled with Jenkins by default, so you probably have that in your Jenkins. If you're not familiar with matrix jobs, they're essentially multi-configuration jobs, which allow you to run different configurations, for example, on different platforms in parallel, and then aggregate the result. So a result might look like this. You can see the 2x2 matrix at the bottom of the page. The way you configure it is that you actually specify axes for the matrix. And what Jenkins does, it takes all the combinations of the parameters, the Cartesian product, and executes all those builds. So here I'm specifying 2 axes, so I'm going to get a 2-dimensional matrix. You can specify an arbitrary number of axes. By default, Jenkins executes all the configurations. There is a way to limit that and exclude some of them, and that's done by specifying the combination filter, which is this tiny field at the bottom of the page. The problem with this is that it's pretty static, and it can get quite complex. If you're running multi-configuration jobs, it might happen that only some of them failed because of some random issue, and you need to restart just these few configurations, which is kind of hard to do because you need to go to the job configuration, change the combination filter, and run the jobs again and revert to the previous change. And it's just very annoying. So that's when Matrix Reloaded plugin comes in. It's a terrible pun, but it's a pretty useful plugin, actually. What it allows you to do is, when the job finishes, you can rebuild the job, and you can select which configurations you need to run. And it's very nice. One problem with that is that you can only select the configurations that you want to rerun. So the first time, you actually need to run the full matrix. And that's the problem that Matrix Combinations plugin solves. So Matrix Combinations plugin, it actually adds a parameter to your job, which is called Matrix Combinations. And then when you run the job, you get a chance to select the configurations that you want to run. So it's a very nice complement to Matrix Reloaded plugin. It would make complete sense to have this a part of the same plugin and part of the Matrix project as well. But that's how it's done in Jenkins. Groovy plugin is a very interesting plugin as well. It allows you to execute Groovy code, which I guess it's similar to many other programming languages and their use in Jenkins. What makes Groovy plugin special is that you can also execute scripts on the master inside master's JVM, which basically means that you can alter the state of your Jenkins instance, which is an incredibly powerful administration tool because you can do literally anything to your Jenkins instance. Here's an example of what such a build would look like. It's just a simple Groovy script. I'm not going to get into details. This one is in particular actually checks and counts how many online and offline slaves you have inside your Jenkins. One of my favorite plugins is Plot plugin. Plot plugin allows you to output sort of key value pairs from your build and interpret them as X and Y coordinates for points that can be drawn into a plot. It supports a couple of plots, really just a few basic ones. It's pretty easy to configure. And once you actually plot these values, it can look something like this. This plugin is very useful in combination with the Groovy plugin. For example, here I use the previous Groovy script to compute the number of online and offline slaves, and here I'm using the plot plugin to show the results. So this is kind of how many slaves I had active throughout the last month. So it's a very nice sort of monitoring and reporting tool. Job restrictions plugin allows you to specify where you can run your jobs and how. So imagine a situation that you have multiple teams in your company sharing the same Jenkins instance, and you don't want people from one team to run their job on machines that belong to the other team. So that's something that you can configure with job restrictions plugin. Here we're looking at the configuration of the node. I'm just selecting that this node can only run jobs which are prefixed with the word Jenkins, which might mean that it's just some kind of system jobs or something like that. There's another plugin which is called ownership, which takes the same concept and extends it a bit further, and it introduces the notion of owners of jobs and slaves. It also includes ownership-based security, so you can configure things like only the owner of this job can do this, all the other people have only read-only access to the job or something like that. Even if you're not using this security, it's still pretty useful. Imagine a situation that you want to use a slave, but there's something running on it. And you're not sure if you can run something else concurrently or if you're going to disrupt someone else's test. So you can just go to the job page and it shows you who the owner of the job is and his email, and so you can contact him and work things out. So pretty useful plugin. Rebuild plugin allows you to trigger a build that you executed before, which sounds like it may not be that useful because you can just hit the build button again. But it actually becomes quite useful if you're thinking of parameterized builds. If you're using parameters extensively, you need to specify them whenever you're running a build. So if you have like 10 parameters in your job and you specify them manually, and then click build, and the build fails immediately because of some random issue, then if you want to restart it, you will need to fill in the parameters again, which is really annoying. With Rebuild plugin, these values get pre-populated from the previous build, so you can just quickly rerun it, basically. I'm guessing most of you are aware that Jenkins has concept of upstream and downstream jobs. What this allows you to do is execute a job after some other job finished with a given status. So in a way, you can use this to simulate very simple workflows. Parameterize Trigger plugin introduces parameters into the equation. It's actually very useful. I've been using it myself extensively, and especially when I was working in QE. Sort of a very simple scenario how we can use it. Imagine you have releases. Whenever there's a new release, you need to run the full test suite. So you probably have a bunch of Jenkins jobs. Typically, only very few things change between the releases. You change the tag of your tests, you change the name of the zip, the version of the product, things like that. So it's very easy to expose these things as parameters. But still, whenever you get a new release, you need to specify all the parameters for all the jobs before you run them. So easily, you can create sort of a trigger job, which would simply take the parameters and just launch all the other jobs with the same parameters. And this is actually what's happening here in the screen. I'm just saying, adding a post-build action. So whenever this job finishes, start downstream project and pass current parameter values to it. So essentially, you can do full release testing with just a single click. If you need more complicated workflows, there are a bunch of plugins which are sort of trying to do that, but until very recently, none of them were really good at it. A couple of months ago, CloudBased open sourced workflow plugin, which in my opinion is the best plugin for workflows there is. It's a very heavy plugin. It could have a talk on its own, so I'm not going to get into details, but just some basic features. It allows you to write very complex workflows in Groovy, and it has a couple of really interesting aspects. When you're writing a Groovy script, you have access to everything you would normally access in a job. So, all the triggers, source code management, things like this. It allows you to create durable pipelines. So you can have long pipelines that, take days to complete, and they survive reboots, for example. You can allocate multiple slaves, multiple workspaces. You can even have a human input integrated into flows, which basically means that your build flow stops at a given point and waits for someone to, acknowledge so that it can get to a new state. So essentially, using this, you could sort of model the full release cycle of a product, from development through productization to QE. It's a very heavy tool, so unless you really need this kind of advanced stuff, it's probably not worth using. But if you do need these complex pipelines, this is the tool to go to. Here's just an example of what a Groovy script could look like. Essentially, with Workflow plugin, you get a new job type where you get a chance to specify the workflow. Description setter is a pretty nice, simple plugin. It allows you to automatically set a description on your build. The way it works is that you specify a regular expression, and when your build finishes, the plugin goes through the console log and matches the regular expression against the lines in your console, and then whatever line is a match, it outputs that value as a description. I've been using it myself to tag builds, with the version of the product that I'm testing. And it's actually really easy to do. You just need to write a line somewhere in the console and then match the line, and it becomes the tag on your build. So it's kind of practical.
The whole line becomes...
No, you can specify an expression. You can extract the specific token out of the line. As I mentioned before, the only way to sort of group slaves in Jenkins is by using labels. And that becomes kind of complex when you have a lot of slaves. So there is this plugin which is called Implied Labels, and it essentially helps you reduce duplicity in labels. So if a slave is tagged as rel6, then it's also a general rel version or a Linux version. So you just specify that if a slave has this label, also automatically assign this other label to it, and that's pretty much how it works. Pretty simple, but very useful for large instances. Environment Injector plugin is actually quite a complex plugin which allows you to do pretty much anything there is with environment variables. You can, for example, set up slaves so that they don't inherit implicit variables from Jenkins. You can inject variables into builds. You can even specify Groovy scripts which get executed. They can process the parameters and they can generate the values that you would use for environment variables. So there's quite a lot of stuff. Here's what the configuration could look like. There's a bunch of options, but basically you could simply specify sort of key value pairs in the last step, and these would get injected as environment variables in your build. Sometimes your builds fail for sort of infrastructure reasons, and the first thing you usually do is trigger that build again, to figure out what went wrong, basically. And that's exactly what Neginator does automatically. So essentially, the plugin allows you to configure things like if the job failed, try it again 5 minutes later, and then maybe do so until it's stable again, or do so for 10 iterations and things like that. It's useful to recover from random errors, and it's also pretty useful if you just want to basically keep bugging people with notifications until they fix a bug. Email extension plugin is another very useful plugin, and it allows you to configure everything there is with email notifications. By default, the setup that you get with Jenkins is pretty simple. You can only specify an address, and you get an email whenever something changed in your build. So if the build fails, you get an email. If it becomes stable after being unstable for a while, you get an email. There's not much stuff to configure, really. With EmailX plugin, you can completely change the content of the message. You can use variables and macros to fill out the message, things like that. You can also specify who to send the message to. You can, for example, send the message to everyone who committed to the project, or to the people who committed since you last executed the build, or just a specific list of recipients. The plugin also comes with a couple of interesting triggers. So you can, for example, set up a different notification for when the build is stable, or you can only send a notification when the build fails 2 times in a row. This one in particular is actually pretty useful with Neginator. You can set up Neginator to run everything twice, just sort of be sure that there's not a random problem. And you can set up the notification to only be sent if the build fails twice in a row, which means that there probably really is a problem with your job. Timestamper is a very, very simple but very useful plugin. The only thing it does, it adds timestamp to the console output of your builds. That's actually pretty useful because you can see things like, okay, this exception was thrown 20 seconds after I started the server, and it kind of helps you narrow down the problem. Copy to slave plugin allows you to transfer data between your masters and your slaves, sort of as part of the build. I guess one of the use cases could be that you have sort of a repository of tools on your master, and then whenever you're running a build, you want to bring in some tools. So you can copy an installation of the server or some configuration files, and then when your build executes, these files are ready. Kind of a similar plugin is Copy Artifact, which transfers files between different jobs. So one use case would be, you're running a job which relies on some kind of third-party library, or a library that is built as part of another job. So you can use this plugin to copy that artifact from that other job to your job. It's also very useful if you're using this upstream-downstream relationship, because that basically allows you to transfer data between the jobs. This is what the configuration could look like. It's pretty simple. You just specify the project name, and you can filter only for specific files, and they become a part of your build. Priority Sorter plugin essentially changes queue in Jenkins into a priority queue. So what it allows you to do is actually create sort of groups of jobs and assign different priorities to them. And jobs with lower priority would be executed earlier than jobs with higher priority. There's quite a lot of stuff to configure. You can also choose things like a queuing strategy, and yeah, basically, it's pretty useful. An example could be, you have a lab where the resources are kind of limited, and you want to make sure that some urgent jobs get through, no matter how many jobs you have scheduled in the queue. So this plugin could help in this case. There used to be a plugin in Jenkins a while ago. It was called Locks and Latches. It still exists, but it's deprecated now. And it basically allowed you to specify locks and specify resources that cannot be accessed concurrently. So you could set up things like, okay, I'm running this performance job, and while I'm running it, I don't want anyone else to write to the same database because it will affect my results. So that's what Locks and Latches allowed you to do. Throttle Concurrent Builds plugin takes this even further, and it allows you to create groups of jobs and then say things like, okay, out of this group, only 10 builds might be executed concurrently in my whole Jenkins, and only one at a time per node, and kind of things like that. So it's very useful if you just want to prevent sort of explosion of builds, or if you just want to set up things like fighting for resources and this kind of stuff. Build Publisher plugin. Build Publisher plugin transfers files from one Jenkins to another. One of the use cases is actually Jenkins that is running on JBoss.org. This Jenkins just accumulates the results of community project builds that are run within Red Hat. Another use case could be that you have several masters within your company. Let's say a single Jenkins master per team, and then you want to share the data between them. So you could set up a shared Jenkins instance, which would just collect the data from all the other Jenkins masters. Job configuration history. Very useful plugin, and it essentially introduces versioning into your job configurations. So think very simple subversion or very simple Git. You get a list of versions. You can have a look at what you changed. You can sort of view diffs. You can restore to the previous configuration, and yeah, this sort of thing. A nice complement to this plugin is Audit Trail, which allows you to perform auditing. So in other words, it logs the important operations that are taking place within Jenkins. You can specify where to log this kind of data. You can specify which actions to log. It comes with a reasonable set of defaults. It logs things like creating jobs, changing configurations of jobs, creating and deleting views, and these kind of things. It's really useful not only for auditing, but even recovering from backup. If you need to find out when something disappeared and how. And yeah, pretty nice tool for administrators. Another really nice tool for administrators is TMP Cleaner. Basically, Jenkins automatically disconnects slaves when they run out of disk space. And that goes both for workspace and temporary space. So it's quite important to, not to store unnecessary data there so that your slaves don't just get disconnected if you don't need it. And that's what TMP Cleaner does. It doesn't actually have any UI. It just reads parameters from the command line, but you can set up things like, run this check every 6 hours, and whenever you do, delete all the temporary files which are older than 2 days, basically. And that's the only thing it does, and it does it well. Credentials plugin, a very useful plugin again. It allows you to store user credentials inside Jenkins. And the plugin exposes API to other plugins so that whenever some other plugin needs credentials, it can ask this plugin for the credentials. So as a user, you can configure sort of username, password pairs. You can create different domains, basically group credentials into different categories, this sort of thing. And then whenever someone needs the credentials, it presents you with sort of a list where you can just select what you previously configured. So here, for example, you see that you're using Git plugin, and we need to access a private repository, so you can select some of the credentials that you pre-created before. Disk usage plugin. I was actually torn whether I should include it in the presentation or not, because it provides functionality which I consider really useful, but we had some serious performance issues with the plugin. So it's probably going to work fine if you're running a small or medium-sized instance, but if you're running a really big instance, you might want to do some proper testing before. It's quite a heavy plugin and very intrusive. What it allows you to do is check how much disk space is occupied by different jobs, so that if in case you need to free up some space, you know where to look. It also kind of records trends for each individual jobs and how much disk space you occupied over time. Docker. There's actually a whole bunch of plugins dealing with Docker, and Vojta is giving a talk today on this specific stuff, so I'm not going to get into details. I just wanted to mention that there is a plugin which allows you to provision Docker slaves, Docker containers automatically. It's called Docker plugin, surprisingly, and yeah, let's not get into details now. A very useful plugin if you're running UI tests that actually require a display is XVNC. What it does is it starts a VNC server on the slave, and it assigns a random display number to your build. So that if you're running UI tests, you can actually use a VNC client to connect to that machine and watch what's happening at what went wrong. It has some further configuration options. You can do things like take a screenshot when your build fails, provided you have installed the right software, and yeah, just a bunch of stuff like this. Sometimes if you want to use plugins effectively, it would be helpful for you as a user to have access to the global configuration of the plugin, just to figure out what the settings are. But this is something that's typically exposed only to administrators. So there is this plugin which is called read-only configurations, and all it does is it gives you access to the configuration page, and it disables all the fields. So essentially you get read-only mode for the configuration. That goes for job configuration as well as the global configuration of Jenkins. Custom tools is another very interesting plugin. It basically allows you to install tools on a slave on the fly. So this works really well for tools which don't require much to be installed. For example, you just need to unzip a file and download the file, things like that. And this allows you to do so without having to actually install the proper package on a specific machine, talk to the administrators, and this sort of stuff. It's pretty useful if you want to, let's say, test your application against the given application servers. You basically specify a configuration, sort of a database of tools. For each of them, you specify a shell command, which is used to install the tool. It might be just a simple unzip. And then when you're running a build, you can actually select which tools you want to have there, and they just become part of your build automatically. And last but not least, a favorite plugin. Well, not my favorite, but it's called Favorite. And the plugin essentially brings bookmarking into Jenkins. So you can see the stars on the right. It basically allows you to add stars to the jobs, and then you can create views which just filter for the jobs that you previously start. So essentially very simple bookmarks for Jenkins, and you can use this to create sort of personalized views with jobs that you access very frequently and things like that. So yeah, I guess that's pretty much all from me. So thank you, and if you have any questions. Yeah.
Can you recommend any plugin for overt integration if I want to use slaves, VMs as slaves, and return after every test run, return the slave to some snapshot, so I'm pretty sure that the environment is clean and it will not blow up because some leftovers from the previous run. Are there any plugins like that?
Right. So the question is how to basically deal with slaves as VMs, how to make sure that you have a clean environment. I'm not actually sure. There's a whole bunch of plugins which deal with sort of cloud providers, which kind of does what you want. The basic one is called JCloud's plugin, and then there's a bunch of plugins which sort of build on top of it. So maybe that can help.
There is one, but I'm not sure if it's already released. But it's work in progress.
Okay.
At least.
Yeah.
I will actually test Jenkins plugins. I don't know if you use some behavior-driven development or something like that. Do you test them? I mean, if you install Jenkins plugin inside Jenkins master, do you test them or not? Or I don't know how you test them?
Right. So the question is if we're testing the plugins that we install, and we do. We actually do fairly rigorous testing. It's both manual testing plus Jenkins has a whole test suite, and most of the plugins actually come with tests. So there's a bunch of automated tests as well.
But you do use some, for example, Cucumber or I don't know some JBA or something for testing Jenkins plugin or I don't know behavior of Jenkins plugins or already running Jenkins.
May I answer that question?
Go ahead.
Well, actually, we have this it's called acceptance test harness for Jenkins, which is an upstream test suite to do end-to-end testing for running Jenkins and for plugins. And it was originally written in Cucumber, but we get rid of this. We sort of needed the flexibility of JUnit, so right now it's using Java. We don't really rely on a behavioral-driven development, but we have this kind of test suite. So basically, what it allows you to do to write a test that integrates to plugin, and when you run it, you can decide what Jenkins version to use and what version of this particular plugin, and it will run the UI test against this
Okay. And second question is how you deal with security issue of Groovy plugin. Because if you run, for example, if you start the Jenkins instance on your machine, I can list your SSH folder and steal your keys, SSH keys. How you deal with that issue?
Right. So the question is how we deal with security when it comes to Groovy scripts.
Groovy script.
Yeah. So you know, one point to mention is, as I was talking about Groovy plugins and the fact that it allows you to specify system scripts that you can use to basically alter anything about your instance. So that's something that's not usually accessible to regular users. That's only accessible to administrators, right?
Okay, but if you start, for example, Jenkins from your user, like Miroslav Cupák, and then I can connect to your machine, your local machine, and steal your SSH key.
Well,
So how to deal with it?
well, okay.
Well, actually, this is a problem. One of the very good security recommendations for Jenkins is whenever your instance is larger, do not run any builds on master. Simply because that any kind of user code can run on your master, even though it's restricted for a particular user. So when there is a larger instance, do not use master for building. This goes actually even further than users can execute an arbitrary Groovy script for the user that is using Jenkins, and this is seen as a problem. In community, in a recent half a year or something, there is this script security plugin which brings the sandboxing from Groovy, and some plugins that was already rewritten or adapted to use this script security. So basically, the point is right now to move every plugins that are executing Groovy on the master process to use this script security to be sandboxed.
Yeah, this is actually a very good question because this is precisely an issue with one of the plugins that I mentioned, and that was the BuiltFlow plugin. It has some serious security problems, and that's fixed in the Workflow plugin because it uses the security plugin that Oliver mentioned.
One other question:
Yep.
Is there some special load balancer plugin for example, balancing load between different Jenkins masters? Because if we have 2,000 jobs and 400 machines or 400 slaves, if you want to run some job, it takes a couple seconds to trigger a job. Is there some load balancer to distribute load between these masters, or there's nothing?
If there is, I'm not aware of it.
Okay.
Sorry. Okay, so thank you. One last thing, I'm running a workshop together with Oliver, which starts with, I think, at 20 minutes actually. So we will be dealing with Groovy scripting and system scripting, and things like REST API and CLI. So if you're interested in this sort of advanced Jenkins features, come to the workshop. Thank you.
Taková účast lidí.